Greetings, BookTube. We are back. This is ML Clark with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I'm really glad to be able to try to get back to my routines. It's been a fairly disrupted few weeks in an interesting year and an interesting timeline, but I'm sure all of you have your own disruptions at present, so I just hope this video finds you well. I'm going to talk briefly about one of those disruptions today, but I'll be talking about it on Better Worlds Theory in a broader way soon. I've already talked about it on Patreon, but there were more updates to the story. Essentially, in the last week and a half, I have taken on a 15-year-old who needs to be back in school, but is not going to be back into school anytime soon because of a lot of bureaucracy, unfortunately. So we're homeschooling, and we were just trying to get her settled, safe, and stable. She does, however, belong to a part of life here in Colombia that I think might be difficult for some folks in North America to process. She works on the street every day, hustling with candy for coin. And that is common for a lot of people here. That's the way that a lot of people make their money or their livelihood, is by doing what they can with a bag of candies, with tinto, with small cheap coffee, drinks, and so forth. She's 15. She should be in school, but a lot of people should have better lives than they do. There was just an opportunity to be able to help in this life when she found the strength to leave an abusive relationship, which is, again, something a person her age should not have to have done, but I'm very proud of her for having done it. I've seen her working on the street for about a year and a half with a group, and this was just the time in which an intervention could be made. Unfortunately, there are a lot of really complicated factors tied into the fact that U.S. aid uh, was really important for the Venezuelan permit program here in Colombia, something that makes perfect sense to try to alleviate migrant flow to your country. It is makes perfect sense to invest in other countries, naturalizing people to their own countries. And that's what Colombia has been doing for the last 3 years, but that program was shut down at the end of January, which means she cannot get a physical copy of a document. She's in the system. She just needs the physical copy of the document waiting behind that door so that she can be enrolled in school. So until that point, it's hard. The reason I wanted to mention this in the middle of what's going to be otherwise a review of Asimov's from last year is that sometimes when doing any of this work, it is hard to remember the importance of it when there are so many ways in which the world is going wrong. So much cruelty, so many people carelessly falling into a lot of really harmful ways of thinking, and a lot of dismantling of carefully built up programs that were supposed to help us move toward a better world for all. It's quite painful. And yet, one of the things that made me realize how important stepping in at this juncture was with this young person is when I had her safely in my apartment for the first night. I gave her a book, and she just started devouring it. She doesn't really get much of an opportunity to be present with a lot of creative practice. Music, for sure, can be a part of one's life while working on the streets, but being able to invest in a book, being able to have the time just for that kind of leisure reading, it's rare in a lot of the world. And to see how much story just immediately absorbed her was that reminder. Even though a lot of what we do is at another level, and we have to remember how tremendously privileged we are to be able to do this work, to be able to have issues over anything related to this work, to be able to gripe at one another or complain about the quality of a certain story or service. At the same time, story is really important to giving a sense of hope and direction and vocabulary for people who are struggling. She was able to talk to me a little bit about some of the issues in her life based on even just the few chapters that she had read from that book. And we're going to continue to work on getting her a proper education, even if it's a homeschooling variety. And I know that the literature components are again going to be incredibly important to giving her voice after a long time in which she has not really had one. So, as much as there's so much pain in the world and it can feel almost like we're living in schism to be doing creative work, to be thinking about creative problems while the world has so many bigger issues, they are all connected. And creative practice is part of the solution to cultivating more empathy, more understanding, and more empowerment just across the board. So, with that in mind, I went back this weekend finally to read Asimov's, and I love Asimov's. It's like coming home to a classic style of science fiction writing that's always fearlessly, confidently of the world that we live in. Oftentimes, the stories in Asimov's have that very deft touch in terms of a science fiction or fantasy direction, and you'll see that in some of the stories today. But nonetheless, there is just that confidence with detail, confidence with establishing the worldliness of these concepts that allows you to see how it all connects. Now, I also love to talk about the nonfiction as well, so we're going through this in order. Unfortunately, I don't also have time for the poetry. I should spend more time with some of the poetry and maybe do a piece on that in the future. But one thing at a time, I just want to get back to my routines. So we're going to start by zipping through November, December 2024 Asimov's. So I still have a couple issues to catch up on, obviously, one thing at a time. But this was such a lovely issue because I've mentioned before, Asimov's is very good at holding past, present, and future together. And there are other ways in which it just confidently embraces community. One of them is the fact that Sheila Williams' editor's note this month, or for this issue, was about the 38th Annual Readers Awards results. And so it lists the winners, and I'll put them in the notes for this piece so you can take a look at it. But I didn't want to focus on the winners so much as the way Sheila wrote about this. She highlighted the fact that these awards, or the votes that were cast, invited readers to comment as well. And by commenting, they could just talk about how good a reading year they'd had and how hard it was to make choices and how much they enjoyed the actual process and the way things were put together. And I thought that was beautiful because I think we sometimes get caught up in awards as if just the announcement of a name is the point. It really isn't. It's about the number of journeys that one can create and the kinds of journeys one can create for readers. And sometimes that goes hand in hand with your name being overwhelmingly chosen for an award, but not always. And to just highlight that special secondary quality, the thoughts that go behind the voting, it's just lovely. So that was a really great approach to it. We next move on to, again, I talk about past, present, and future, Robert Silverberg's column. Oh gosh, I don't know how many more years we're going to have of them, but in this piece, he made it clear he does write them in advance, quite a bit in advance. He wrote this one about a year before it was going to be published, which adds a little something to it because he is reflecting in this piece on Elon Musk's new humanoid line, and his concerns about it in relation to a classic science fiction story. And the piece is not outdated, but my goodness, it has been changed a little bit by how much there is associated with that name right now in our context. Nevertheless, Silverberg's wonderful at tying these contemporary issues into the classic work of science fiction and fantasy, and in so doing, reminding us that really we have been here before. We have done all of this before. So we look in this piece at Jack Williamson's With Folded Hands from 1947, which is an excellent reminder that all of our anxieties about automation have been present in the literature for as long as science fiction has been around. This one is a wonderful story. I don't know if any of you have read it, probably some, but in the era in which it was written, there is a sort of matter-of-fact quality to a lot of the prose, and yet there's a lot of power that can come through those very decisive, declarative lines that aren't so much focused on lyricism as they are about just presenting a scenario. And when we come to the end of the story, we have the sense of the machines really making it so there's really no use for the humans, and that anxiety is something that we have today with a few added components based on the fact that there are some human beings who want a lot of other human beings to feel useless. We have these class divides now. But Silverberg is absolutely right to focus on the fact that we have really not been presented with a new challenge with respect to today's so-called AI. It has been with us for as long as there has been sort of a machine element to human processes, and our anxiety about wither the human in the middle of them. So, really good piece. James Patrick Kelly also had a really good complementary classic theme looking at anxieties about aliens and the various calculations, the various models over time used to address those anxieties and to think about the actual probability or improbability of alien encounters. And it's a really deft historical approach, very much looking at the historiography of how we have framed the question over time. So there's a lot of food for thought and also a lot of different measures that can be brought to bear on any writing we do now. This piece goes up to recent US discourse, and we had in recent years this big hullabaloo about possible objects in the sky and possible releases from the government, but it belongs to a long history of every generation trying to frame its calculations. And so even the mathematics and the science of assessing this quote unquote risk or possibility has a cultural component. And I think that comes through very clearly in his nonfiction. Then we go into the fiction and we hop in with, wow, just a Kristine Kathryn Rusch's stories are just so good. Just such a confident writer. She is just a powerhouse. And so, of course, you don't always start with a novella, but this issue starts with a novella that earns it. It earns its word count tremendously well. It's called Death Benefits. And it is, again, loosely science fiction. There are science fiction elements that frame the space. And yet, the main quality of the story is something that is entirely germane to a lot of trauma that we have around worldly scenarios of war right now. We have people who are coping with loss and disruption of life and separation from loved ones. And this story imagines the trauma of war, especially through people in denial about their dead loved ones. And it imagines an individual who has sort of carved out a space as a detecting figure, but mostly he just exists to let people down when they come to him trying to say, "Oh, I've seen my loved one, they're not actually dead." And we also have in the middle of the story this lovely thread of another kind of career that has also come up to help people with the hardships of war. In the middle of the main story, we have these portraits of some of the other people going through trauma. And honestly, nothing about the story can be immediately pinned down in relation to a specific conflict in our world, and yet it all feels deeply resonant. And that is just the power of exceptionally good science fiction. So, a deeply human piece that resonates with a lot of the world grief that we're going through, wise, intelligent in its construction of character and place, and very confident in its storytelling without needing to be on the nose in any way. So, if you haven't read Kristine Kathryn Rusch's stories, I'd highly recommend giving her a go, this or many of her other works. The next one also was just an absolute treat of a read, very different kind of story. Molly Gloss's Wápato, and this one has a very strong sense of character as well and a strong sense of place. I think a lot of science fiction writers sometimes forget, probably myself included, I'll say, because a lot of my stories are in very much otherworldly spaces. But there are so many phenomenal writers of science fiction who just center, ground their work within the world that we have. And it's something I should probably do myself. I'm not entirely sure why I've been nervous about writing in that form, but it works really well in the right hands. So Gloss does a phenomenal job here of imagining a woman who outlives her husband on a remote island where she tends to her horses and a donkey, and she experiences time slippages on the property and ghosts, but they're not really enough to give her a sense of community. And so the story is ultimately about her building community and connecting with somebody else who's, I guess, been living a little bit of a different life or an estranged life in some ways. And the fact of these time slippages and the ghosts serves as a bond. And so here the speculative element is slight, but sufficient to connect people with a vocabulary that they might not otherwise have. And that would, again, makes this such a powerful work of speculative fiction is that it very confidently weaves in the slightly above normal with a lot of touches that are very much of the world. Wonderful language and quite sharp when it comes to the themes and the topics that are discussed. The next piece is also very wise and worldly. It might just be the way I think about pretty much everything in Asimov's. I have difficulty reading this publication, but sometimes sitting after and thinking, my goodness, I'm never going to be able to write anything as good as any of this, because there are just so many wonderful, confident writers in this publication, and Sheila Williams does a phenomenal job with her creation. So Garrett Ashley, So Long in Miami, has somebody who's been on a colony for a while. He's been pining for Earth. He wants to go home, and he chooses to return when he has the opportunity to Miami. This is in a post-flooded world. A lot of places are damaged, and it's only through scientific research and similar projects that people get to return. But he's come back also to that space because he thought that there was another person who'd been born on Earth who's now stationed there. And so he really wanted to connect with another Terran as opposed to someone who'd been born on the colonies. Unfortunately, that's not quite how things work out. And he has to cope with the fact that there's been deception and disappointment in a way that's extremely resonant to how a lot of people make moves and big life decisions only to be disappointed on the other side. And there's really not much else he can do once he's had this disappointment happen. He's now stuck. And it is about how we build on from those disappointments. So, again, pragmatic, slight science fiction component, but the element that's there works so well to drive a truly concrete and detail oriented and real story of human struggle, which is, again, just what one wants from good science fiction. The next piece also is powerful in a different way. This one I think is a little more hyperbolic than the other ones, but not entirely out of the realm of what we might see in the next few years. And I say this specifically because we are already in the recent news cycles dealing with AI, so-called AI, ostensibly or possibly being used to decide whether people get to keep their jobs. And that's what happens in this story too. So this is Dominica Phetteplace's Dreamliker, and it offers this very potent vision of an AI-ridden future, which nonetheless works tremendously well because it's grounded in our class struggle. It's grounded in the fact that there's socioeconomic precarity now, and any new system of quote unquote AI might create these new luxury markets, and where if you are a really good, hardworking individual who adds those personal touches in a world where almost everything is automated, maybe you can get a chance at a job and be able to get ahead, but you're still going to be fighting this deluge of algorithmic mediocrity every step of the way, and it is going to work against you no matter how hard you try to carve out a space for yourself as an individual and hustle your heart out. And so there's this really fascinating set of interplays around questions of honesty and deception and artificiality and sincerity. And it just is a story that hits very close to home, especially I think for a lot of freelancers out there. Then we also have James Maxey's Mere Flesh, which is a little more humorous than the others, but still a binding theme of these slight sci-fi elements highlighting something that is deeply true to us. So in Mere Flesh, we have a man who's been trying to look after his father and maybe thought that it would be easy now that his father is in a medical state that doesn't allow him to move, but has had his consciousness uploaded to a sort of AI body. And nonetheless, he did not anticipate that in that AI body, his father would want to do everything possible and be just as vulnerable to being suckered into all kinds of late life flings as one might expect from the mere flesh that would have existed before. So AI doesn't magically solve problems. It only allows for we humans to continue our usual spate of problems in new forms. So that one's, I think, a funnier version of some of the others, but with a deeply human core. Then we also have Zack being, this actually ties into a few pieces we've had in Clark's world as well. So this is, I really think that the people are not struggling, but they're crafting a new subgenre around this. Zack B's The Start of Something Beautiful has Seven Cartagena as an influencer who's gone up into space with another influencer and one astronaut on the ship as well. She's sponsored by someone on Earth who wants her to be the first human to create, real art in space. But she is lacking in creative inspiration, even though she's in the space station, until there is a crisis on board that allows her to actually be present and live in the moment. And that's when we realize, again, the reason she couldn't create before is everything was artificial. You have to actually be fully human where you are in order to be able to unlock some of that creative praxis. And so there's some really nice tensions in there, and it's well done in terms of little details as well. The next one, Peter Wood's Murder on the Orion Express. It's interesting. He's described this as his attempt at a whodunit, but it's a lot more than a whodunit. I think he's being very sneaky in describing it as such, because it's on a generation ship. And in this generation ship, well, maybe not so much a generation ship, we have to be very careful about that. This ship has cryogenic freezing, and then everyone is woken in cycles to do their 6-month stint, or maybe some of them are going to do more. So it's not really a planned voyage for them to be on there for many generations, but a lot of different generations of things happen during the staggered waves of people waking up and going back to sleep. So it's a story that, as a result, gets to play with time a little bit. And on top of that, there is this political division that's been formed between part of the crew that thinks that the ship is heading for a real disaster, and the other part that thinks that the first crew is just trying to control and manipulate the system, the electoral system. And there are some resonance points in a lot of those politics, which I think Peter was trying to slip under, but it's really well done in terms of providing a sense of two different sides, two different factions that keep saying, oh, this is all politics, but it's not all politics, because there is either a really big, devastating event coming for the ship or not. And so the question of what is actually real behind the politics is going to be critical to the murder mystery, which is the frame device. It's a sneaky piece that has many layers and is definitely worth your time. The next one, Jack Skillingstead's The Ledgers. This one is probably, out of all of the pieces here, this is a mood piece. I would highly recommend not reading this one trying to fully understand what's going on. We have Hank living in a kind of bewildering world. It's at war. There are most of the population has left already. Those who remain are starving. They're deprived of a lot of companionship that they might have had in the old world, and there is definitely disorientation that comes with it, paranoia, division, and at the same time a notion of the work, a notion of trying to do one's duty. And it really feels like a mood piece. It's well done, but I would not try to decipher too much from it. Just let it wash over you. The next one, speaking of letting things wash over you, Mary Robinette Kowal's Deep Space Has the Beat. Again, a very slight sci-fi element, but used to great effect, because what it is doing is highlighting the number of pressures that are going to continue to exist for us in any context. So we have somebody who's trying to get investors for a project that will use a dance floor to harvest kinetic energy, which will be really good for space station life. But it's really hard to get investors when somebody is hacking your systems while you're trying to give a really good example and a good experience to them on when they're in your space. So we have usual human anxieties playing out with slightly different stakes in terms of the ultimate project that it's going to be helping, but very human, frantic energy about trying to make sure everyone has a good time and is not disrupted by the usual saboteurs that one has whenever advancing new technology. And then that brings us to the next novella to close out the issue. And this one has a very classic feel to it. There's a satisfying turn, and I think we all know where it's going to go. But at the same time, it is a good take on the journey. We have a fellow named Ed. He's on a ship that arrives looking at a planet because there were signs of life, and yet they seem to have sort of dried up when he gets there, which is very strange. And then a missile takes out his ship, and he's in this narrow little nacelle that also serves as a life pod. So he crash lands on the planet. He discovers there are life forms. Then he discovers that there are also other life forms. I'm going to be vague here. And his experience is moving from one environment to another, just really richly drawn out. And so this is again an adventure piece. It's one just to take one chapter at a time, one part of the adventure at a time, as Ed comes to a determination of where he's going to fit in after having lost one part of his world and having discovered another part and another part and another part of the new one. So there is more of an episodic feel to this one. It has a really classic feel in that way. One could have expected it as a serial novel from a different era, and yet it's done with some of the deft touches that show that authors today are building on what came before. So that's always nice. And lastly, we have the On Book section by Kelly Jennings, which is just a rich treasure trove. I don't know if you take the time to read book reviews, but I recommend it, especially if you're a writer. There's so many gems out there, and they can be so good for inspiring you or for guiding your own practice. I'm going to talk specifically about one in this list that immediately piqued my interest. A lot of them did in many different ways, but one of them specifically because it resonates with something I'm working on for my next project. So whether you read just for pleasure or as a writer constantly thinking about the upcoming work, it is really important, I think, to touch base with some of the work that's out there and to just be excited for your fellow authors. So in this issue, Kelly Jennings' piece has S.J. Klapecki's Station 6, Nancy McCabe's Vaulting Through Time, Walter Mosley's Touched. I'm always excited by a new Walter Mosley. Alix Harrow's Starling House, Naomi Kritzer's Liberty's Daughter. We have Soul Jar, which is edited by Annie Carl. We have Rosalind's Sibling, which is edited by Bogi Takacs. We have Out There Screaming, edited by Jordan Peele. Yes, that Jordan Peele. And that one got a really good review, even though Jennings is not necessarily a fan of horror. Very much enjoyed these pieces. I'm not saying that Jennings hates horror and then was just surprised, but it's just not Jennings' preferred subgenre or genre. And nonetheless, these stories stood out, which is a really good sign. And then Kelly and Zack Weinersmith's A City on Mars. But I want to talk just a little bit about the first one, because the description of S.J. Klapecki's Station 6 immediately made me want to acquire this one and read through it, because it seems to be working on some themes that I want to work on for my next piece. When I write, the next novel is going to be a class-oriented space thriller set in a station and dealing with a lot of socioeconomic politics. And from the description here, that's definitely something that's been explored in some interesting ways. A figure who moves from very fairly disempowered worker to somebody who feels empowered to make a difference in some union activities aboard ship. So it's going to be interesting to test my thoughts and my ideas for the book that I am currently outlining by reading this other piece, not in competition, but because it's so good to know what's in the well right now, what's in the water that we're all drinking, and how are we negotiating that shared water. So I really recommend writers spend some time with those book review sections, celebrate the work of fellow writers, find your next passion read, and also think carefully about where your work fits into this bigger schema. And hopefully it will inspire you. It might inspire, I will end, and it might also humble. I've had this conversation recently with my dear writing friend of many years. We both have moments where when we read a book, we're just laid low by it to the point where we think, well, I'll never write like that, and I'm never going to be good enough. And it's an interesting feeling. Not everybody has it when they read, but it's one that I personally enjoy sitting with, because I know it's going to motivate growth. I know it's a good thing to have a level of humility about constantly growing and improving in one's praxis. And especially, I see so very much need in the world, and I've always struggled to figure out how to contribute to it. With nonfiction, with fiction, I poured my heart out in a lot of work that just didn't quite fit the markets, and it didn't make enough sense, or it didn't resonate well enough with larger audiences, and that's fine. I worked a lot of my short fiction. When I put it together and compiled it, I also had to move through a sense of grief over realizing how much of my writing career had been consumed by certain themes, of feeling very limited and having limited agency, and that coming through in a lot of the writing of these other spaces. So I look at this and I think, okay, well, that's everything done to date. struggling to find a space for my voice, struggling to pour my heart out in a way that could better impact the world. But with this next piece, it's just going to be an entirely different register. And I know that I will use everything that I have experienced, and it will hopefully inform a body of work going forward that's going to be stronger, more lively, maybe get a larger audience share, who knows. But the most important part is that all throughout the process, I know that I have not lost my ability to just be awestruck by my fellow writers. And I think that's a good thing to have in your wheelhouse, is the ability just to be blown away and to be excited and to be inspired. And if you lose that, I think that's when you've really lost the passion for creative practice. So I'm quite happy when I'm laid low by work, and I was laid low by a couple of stories in this issue. I hope you are as well. We'll come back to Asimov's again because I do quite enjoy the balance of Clark's World as sort of a new order publication that has a very specific style and approach, and Asimov's, which has just been a standard bearer for our industry for so long and is just in such wonderful hands under Sheila Williams in terms of very steadily balancing past, present, and future for our genre. But we'll also try to slip some other work in as well. I have a piece coming up, an anthology of Canadian science fiction that I look forward to sharing with you sometime soon. But again, to close off, the real world is horrible right now in so many ways. There's so much injustice in it and so much hardship. But when I talk about being laid low, I was laid low by handing a book to a 15-year-old who spends most of her time working on the street nothing, for nothing, and who can't get into school right now because USAID has been shut off, and there's no other way for those offices right now to be open so she can get her paperwork. Just devastating. And yet, the way she just took to a story and the way that story gave her immediate vocabulary reminds me that it is all connected. And the work that we do is not wasted. All of the times that we have failed to achieve what we wanted to, or to connect the way we wanted to, poured our heart out on the page and not reach the people that we wanted to, it still is part of a really big and important weave. So we'll keep working on it, each of us from our own little threads. And I'm deeply grateful to you for having spent time with me on this thread today. Wherever this finds you in your own creative practice, as readers, as writers, as other kinds of creators, I just hope that you feel connected. So by all means, check out Asimov's. And if it's not Asimov's for you, if there's another magazine, make sure you support the work, support those creators. You can support, obviously, this channel by liking and subscribing because it helps with the algorithms. But I'm just chuffed if you made it to the end. So thank you again. Take good care of yourselves, and we'll see you again hopefully sometime soon.